A nationwide math test administered to 4th and 8th grade students has turned up some disturbing results. Now, scores among 8th graders increased only slightly, and for the first time in almost 20 years, the 4th grade scores did not improve at all. Joining me now to discuss our education system, whether it is actually failing our kids, is Beth Fertig, a senior reporter for WNYC Radio and author of the new book, Why Can't You Teach Me to Read? We were also joined by Steve Perry, principal and founder of Capital Preparatory Magnet School and CNN education contributor, and also author of Raggedy Schools. We're also joined by Sam Chaltain, the national director of the Forum for Education and Democracy, and also an author of American Schools, The Art of Creating a Democratic Learning Community, which comes out next week, by the way, so that will be fun to read also. Beth, I'd like to start with you. You have followed some very tough story, followed some very hard cases in the New York school system. Tell me a little bit about what you observed and why there is such abysmal failure.
Well, I reported on 3 students who got all the way to high school without learning to read. And because they were students with disabilities, they managed to win settlements from the city because students with disabilities are entitled to a free and appropriate public education. These students were immigrants. Their parents came from the Dominican Republic, having very little formal education at all. And so when the students ran into trouble, Yamilka, Antonio, and Alejandro, their parents didn't really know what they could do to help them until they got a lawyer who was able to win them settlements in the form of private tutoring. And they're very extreme cases because they have learning disabilities like dyslexia, but there's many, many students who can't read anywhere near the level we expect. Is it institutional?
Yeah, the 3 cases are interesting, but is it institutional in your opinion?
I would say, in fact, in New York City, test scores have been going up. We don't know how much because we've seen a huge discrepancy between state scores and national scores, as you mentioned with the NAEP results. But we are seeing fewer students at the bottom because there are more reading interventions that are available. But I would caution by saying that a quarter of the country's 8th graders were reading below a basic level on the last national exam 2 years ago, which means that's probably the level of a high school dropout.
Let's review some of these numbers that we just went through. In grade 4, in the tests, the most recent tests, there were no learning gains, and we ranked 11th in the world. In grade 8, there were slight learning gains. We're 9th in the world. Now, Steve, you're a principal at a very successful school. Everyone's going to college out of your school. When you see statistics like this, what do you think? And actually, can you pinpoint what we're doing wrong? What's the secret here?
There's a lot that we're doing wrong. First of all, our schools are not designed to produce optimum results. We have a short school year relative to the rest of the world. Those nations that are beating us have longer school years.
Your kids go to school all year round.
201 days. In addition to that, it's very difficult to fire bad teachers. Throughout the nation, we find that district after district is struggling to keep scores up by keeping performance up by getting rid of the least effective teachers. And the problem is that we have ineffective administrators and very powerful teachers' unions.
Mm-hmm. All right. I'd like to ask Sam, because you're a former New York public school teacher, and what is the situation with teachers? Are there incompetent teachers? You say you should treat them like an athlete. What do you mean by that?
Well, that is a reference to a campaign that my organization is a part of with a lot of other organizations. It's called the Rethink Learning Now campaign, rethinklearningnow.com. And the philosophy behind it is that in this lead up to the next iteration of federal education policy, we have to make sure that we restore our collective focus on the rightful bullseye of education reform, which, to Steve's point, is on learning and on the core conditions that best support that. Now, what's happened over the years, despite the best of intentions, is what we've actually created is a culture of testing more so than a culture of learning. So the way that teachers come into that is we all know that teachers are the most important in-school factor for determining whether or not young people can be successful. What we need to do from a policy perspective is think about how to invest in a true teaching profession as opposed to a teaching force.
And we have such a diverse country now. There are so many students with all different learning styles that the teachers need to be prepared to work with all different types of students. We've never before expected universal college readiness the way that this president has said we should.
I really would like to take a clip. President Obama was in New Orleans yesterday, and he commented on the success and failure of the previous administration's No Child Left Behind policy. Let's listen to that for just a moment.
And one of the problems with No Child Left Behind was that it had a bunch of tests and had I think legitimately, high expectations, but it didn't always follow through with the tools that schools needed in order to actually achieve these goals that had been set.
Okay, Sam, you were talking about testing and the No Child Left Behind, really focused on testing. What do you have, your reaction to President Obama's comments, and also the fact that there's new money being put forward in this? There's Race to the Top, $4.35 billion that's now going to be additional money put into this problem. Is this a money issue?
Not exclusively. It's an unprecedented opportunity. But what we have to do first is make sure that we're focusing on the right end result. So part of what our campaign is saying is we have to have three pillars that are the core foundation of any successful reform at the local level, but also federal education policy. Learning, and so one of the ways that we're starting to create, I think, a more receptive environment for policies like that is we're asking people all across the country, from citizens to senators to actually the Secretary of Education himself, to share their personal story of their most powerful learning experience. The logic being, once we see across all of these stories the core conditions that are most important to creating a powerful learning environment, and I can guarantee you they're the conditions that are at the core of schools like Steve's, we can help policymakers start asking a different set of questions and figuring out how does it that we empower all educators to create those types of environments for all kids, not pass policies that hinder educators from doing so.
Mm-hmm. Steve, when you see this money, new money coming, do you see it as a plus, or do you think this really goes beyond money?
Money is not the issue. One of the problems is that the people who are making the most decisions know the least about education. They spend the least amount of time in the classrooms or schools, and they have discussions and opinions, but have no real on-the-ground experience. What we need to do is we need to let the most successful models begin to populate the school system, so children can choose those schools that are choose from those schools that are most successful, as opposed to going to the school in their neighborhood. And that's what so many children have to do, especially when we look at the difference between students of color's performance and students who are white and Asian. What we find is in cities such as Atlanta, 75% of the 8th graders not passing that state's examination to move on, 75% of the African-American 8th graders not passing that state's examination to move on to the 9th grade.
Right.
This is an abomination. It's not about money because it costs more to fail than to be successful.
That's a great point. Beth, thoughts on the whole money versus skills and rejiggering the whole, the entire system?
Well, you're absolutely right that it costs more to fail. New York City had to pay about $300,000 in tutoring for the 3 students in my book to learn how to read. Now, we can't afford that type of failure, and I think what's very interesting is we're going to be seeing in the stimulus money that you talked about that states are going to be competing for, that comes with certain strings attached. States are going to have to compete by showing that they can measure which teachers are most effective, and that's going to make the union very agitated because they don't want to tie test scores directly to which teachers are most effective. That's a difficult thing to measure, is who's most effective
necessary,
teacher.
you believe?
Right. It's profoundly necessary. One of the problems is they want to be treated like professionals, but they don't want to be measured for their professionalism. If a child fails if you have a class of children who are failing in your class, then you should not be allowed to move on to the next level while you're pushing children on to the next grade level.
But every teacher gets a different class full of students, and it's hard to do a fair comparison of who has who in their classroom.
Yes.
Sam, I was just going to say, I think there's some important nuance there. I mean, so I have a 10-week-old son at home, so I don't have to worry yet about where he goes to school. But if I were to have to make that decision now, the only data that I would have at my disposal would be the school's 3rd and 8th grade reading and math scores, which reflect basic skills standardized tests. I'm not suggesting that those tests aren't valuable. I am suggesting they're overvalued. And so the only way that we can get a fuller appreciation of whether or not a school is actually creating the optimal environments for learning is if we look at a number of different measures to assess how teachers are effective. And I know Steve knows from his own experience, and I know from my experience as a teacher, teachers work best in a collaborative environment. So we can't come up with incentives that discourage them from doing the exact type of work that will best serve kids.
You know, I think this is a fabulous discussion. I can't wait for you all to get your message out in your books, and I hope everyone reads them. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Steve Perry, Sam Chaltain, and Beth Furtick, thank you.